I said, today we're actually going to be talking about the South. And you may be thinking, well, why in the world are we talking about the South when the whole chapter is about the West? Well, some of it is because there are some things regarding the South that have some similar characteristics and draw some parallels to the West. There's a little bit of that, but a lot of it is really for just because there's really no better place to put it. It's just kind of a good place to fit it in. And it's some of it, again, is some stuff that actually was covered a little bit at the end of or during the whole unit on Reconstruction. Again, that was done virtually last year, so some of you may not have taken away some of the stuff you needed to at that time. Some of you may not have gotten to it at all. But we need to also just understand some of these concepts so we can be set up for things that are to come as we go through the course. We need to kind of have a good understanding of the economic, social, and political situation in the American South, because we'll be talking a lot as we go through about changes to that and challenges to that. So we need to have a good understanding of what was going on here. So I call this the post-war South. Let's clarify what we mean by post-war. What war are we talking about there? Clearly the Civil War. So we want to talk about ways that the South changed and didn't change in the decades following the Civil War. So again, we know that the whole era of Reconstruction, so we're kind of talking about the Reconstruction. Hold on a second, what's going on here? Let's see. Why are we? That Reconstruction, the era of Reconstruction lasting from the end of the Civil War in 1865 to officially in 1877, one of the big components of Reconstruction was this vision of sort of redesigning and recreating the South more in the image of the North. Again, this was talked about at the end of last year, but there was a concept, a vision of this supposed or so-called New South. We're going to talk about the economic changes that were kind of envisioned in the South and maybe get a little bit more detailed and a little bit more specific than I was last year about what of this actually happened and what of it actually didn't. So you may remember from last year this whole concept of the New South, the Old South being the South before the Civil War, and the New South was this version of the South after the Civil War, based on this notion or this premise that the South simply could not go back to the way it was. It could not go back to this strictly agricultural, very little industry, that whole economic structure of the South prior to the Civil War, that part of what was at war during the Civil War was that kind of economic tension, and the South had to modernize and had to change. So that concept of a New South was this vision of a South that more resembled the North, a South with industry, a South with a more self-sufficient economy. What does that mean if something is self-sufficient? It can sustain itself on its own. It's not as dependent on other parts of the country, or it's not so dependent on other things. For example, the South prior to the Civil War, extremely dependent on manufactured goods, and we know that caused a lot of troubles and various debates and arguments, but arguing that the South needed to have a little bit of both. They needed to diversify, and they wanted to see a South with industries, with factories, with roads and railroads and, competitive wages and more towns and all those kind of things, more like the North. Again, more modern capitalism, with free enterprise and business flourishing and all those kinds of things. So we know that that was kind of part of the vision that a lot of Republicans, people supporting Reconstruction had for the South, and a lot of Reconstruction policies were attempting to implement that and attempting to achieve that goal. So you saw during Reconstruction, trying to incentivize, or states or local governments trying to incentivize industry, trying to make, for example, tax exemptions for businesses, trying to make an attractive situation for investors. So someone that's looking to invest in a new business or start a factory might see the South as a good option, that was an attractive place to build a business because the taxes are low and wages are low and all these kind of things. So there were policies and tax structures put in place in the South following the Civil War to try to attract business and to try to get more of that in the South. So let's talk about what actually happened. Was there some success here? Well, there was to an extent. The whole concept of the New South, I think a lot of you know that in the end it is quite limited, but that doesn't mean that there were changes. Actually, we tend to overlook it, but it's true that the South does transform pretty dramatically after the Civil War. It's just not as much as a lot of people kind of wanted, and not as much as a lot of people might have thought. So there was some economic progress. We do see the growth of some larger cities and towns in the South. Now, certainly not as much in the North, but there are certainly more large cities and industrial cities even in the South. It's just still a minority. For example, not far from us, Birmingham in Alabama becomes a major steel producing center. Atlanta grows. It was already a pretty big city in the South, but it continues to experience growth and development. Memphis, Richmond, some of those again were cities, some of the South's larger cities before the Civil War, but there are more that weren't, like Birmingham, for example, which was kind of a little backwards crossroads before that. So there are some more cities being developed, partly because of that new industry. Birmingham, again, being a case in point. The reason it grows is because of the steel industry that was taking off there, and it becomes one of the leading steel producing centers in the country, right there in the heart of the South. Mostly, though, the industry that does take root in the South is, for the most part, not going to be steel and oil. There's some of that, like I said, in Birmingham and places like that. What do you know is the main reason or the main industry that becomes successful in the South? Textiles. So the thing that does, though, the industry that does become more successful in the South, kind of the one exception that does become pretty dominant in the South, is the textile industry. The South does become a leader regarding the textile industry. And what again are textiles? Clothes, cloth, okay? And that kind of makes sense. Why would the South, do you think, be a prime location for the textile industry to take off? All cotton is there, absolutely. So it's just kind of fed into it. Now, these are usually smaller cotton mills. That's what some of these pictures show. You see the people out there in the field picking cotton and tending to the crops with the textile mill right behind them. So textiles are successful in the South. In fact, the South eventually surpasses New England as being the major producer of textiles. That had been in the New England states like Massachusetts and so forth, where the Industrial Revolution first took off in the United States, and it first took off in textile mills. And then by the turn of the century, the South has kind of surpassed New England in a lot of that. So there truly is a lot of growth. There truly is a lot of change. There are a significant amount of railroads that are built in the South. We do see a great deal of that. We know that the South had lagged behind in railroad construction, had not seen that as necessary, had not wanted it, had certainly not wanted to pay for it. In the years during Reconstruction and following Reconstruction, huge amount of railroad building in the South to facilitate a lot of that industrial growth, connecting some of those newer industrial centers. So there is a great deal of construction in that area. However, like I said, we know that this vision of the New South is still quite a limited one. The thing is, there are dramatic changes. There are tremendous changes, but it just still, even with that, it still doesn't look anything like what a lot of supporters of this vision of the New South kind of wanted, because the South still remains, even despite some of these dramatic changes, even with all the new textile mills, even with the railroad building, all of those kind of things, the South still remained overwhelmingly agricultural. So it does still remain agricultural more than anything else. And for many people in the South, a lot of them remain in poverty and doing the same things they had always done. Even though there are drastic changes and that were certainly affecting the lives of a lot of people, there were still, most people that were kind of doing some of the same things. And it's weird, it seems kind of ironic that in a lot of cases, some of the business that was developing in the South and some of that railroad building and all of that, the South may have been benefiting from those things in some ways, but they weren't necessarily turning huge profits from it, because a lot of the the business, a lot of the railroad building, the investment that was taking place in the South, it was the North that was doing that investment. It was Northern business people that a lot of the time were making the investments in those industries. It was Northern banks that were financing these railroads. It was Northern banks that were, or sometimes, certainly not businesses in the South that were financing, other kinds of, whether it was building bridges or building dams and stuff like that. A lot of those new public works projects, a lot of the time the money for that was coming really from the North, and therefore who's going to get the profit from it? The North will. So a lot of the time the financial gain that's going to come from that is really going to Northern banks and Northern businessmen and not so much to the South itself. And so it may not necessarily be being reinvested back in the South. So what we see in the South for a lot of people is a lot of continued poverty, again, because in many cases those changes, the people really benefiting financially from them were the people that held the other end of the purse strings, and those people were oftentimes not from the South or not in the South. Overall, Southern workers, whether they were in textile mills or whatever, overall wages in the South were a lot lower. So typically, Southern workers, say in a textile mill, were typically earning a lower wage than someone doing a similar or the same job in perhaps some Northern states. Many people, of course, remain in the fields doing agricultural work. We'll mention the sharecropping system again here in a second, just to clarify. But things, again, continue in many ways to be kind of the same. And the reasons for this, for one thing, you just really couldn't. It just kind of was impossible when you think about it. It's impossible to make the South catch up with the North in such a short amount of time. You can't make the kind of progress in the South in a period of 10, 20, even 30 years. What had taken the North really a century. They didn't build that stuff overnight. The North did not develop a diversified industrial economy in a day or not even 10 years. Those were things that had really, the seeds for that had been planted, really arguably as early as colonialization. They had already been more diverse. They had already, kind of had their fingers in different pies. They had been industrializing since the early 1800s and so forth. There had been multiple, programs and multiple tax policies and economic policies to encourage industrial development. And to say that you're going to make the South catch up to that in 10, 20 years is just kind of impossible. So it was just so far behind. They were just already so far behind. They weren't going to catch up quickly. You could make dramatic changes, but it wasn't going to just look totally brand new all of a sudden.
What does the period of colonization really look like? Like what all was going on?
In the North?
Just in general, what all was happening when you said in the early 1800s when colonialization?
Early 1800s would have been past colonialization, but that would have been when industrialization was just beginning to start to, take off in the North. It really doesn't get going until more after 1812 or so. Yes.
Just a little bit of trivia, but Lanier and Lafayette, those towns, those are named after Lafayette Lanier, who's an industrialist. Have you been to the old textile mill in Lanier?
No, but this is in Valley.
Yeah, that as well.
Yeah.
In Valley as well.
Uh-huh.
And right around that textile mill, you can see old housing, some of the old stores, and you have the school that's right next to it. So you can see the growth that industrialization.
Yeah, whole mill towns, communities.
Yeah.
Yeah, with the housing that oftentimes was built by the employer sometimes. You're right, absolutely right. And it's interesting to see what's happened in communities like that since the textile industry has largely, collapsed in this area.
If you go there now, most of the mill is level.
Oh, yeah.
So,
yeah.
It's kind of impressive.
It really is. Same's kind of true. There's parts of Opelika that are like that. Some of the cotton mills there, and that cotton mill was abandoned for the one I'm thinking of years, and it burned down a handful of years ago. But yeah, you can still see the part of my hometown was like that. You can see the part of the town that was at one time all the housing, post office, the store. There was a jail. Really kind of neat, and like you said, sad to see. some of that go away.
The one about Piggly Wiggly, like it.
There's a couple. I'm thinking of the one that it's not next to Piggly Wiggly. It's like kind of behind like where Outback is.
Oh,
Like
I
back
know.
there?
Yeah,
It's just nothing now. But there's a famous movie film there.
yeah, I know something.
Norma Ray.
Yeah,
Yeah, Long Sally Field. It was filmed there, and that motel in Blaga. Felicia is still there. Interesting. But now, like, and you could, like, I've never seen that whole movie all the way through. I admit that the very end of it, where she's just standing on the road, like, you can go drive down and find the spot where she was standing there. But there was a big textile mill behind her that's all gone now. But very interesting. And we'll talk later about some of the things that, led to a lot of the textile mills and that whole industry, leaving the South and leaving a lot of communities like Valley and others kind of destitute in some cases, or having to find other things to, support themselves. People leaving, a lot of places becoming abandoned, some able to transition and survive, and some not so much. Okay, so the South just simply lags behind, as I mentioned. Another reason is that Southern workers, or in the South, we know that the education system had lagged behind as well, that the South had for a long time not invested in public education. And while that was something that was changing and improving and remained improved after Reconstruction, it still had an effect. And the South, even still, didn't invest near as much in industrial training and schools to train people and give people skills for factory work and that kind of stuff. So a lot of investors, people that might have wanted to start factories and such, might not have seen the South as quite an attractive location, because the workforce may not have been as prepared for the kind of work they were doing. That is also one of the things that drives the wages down too, or one of the reasons why wages were not as high for workers, is because they didn't possess as good skills or a high of education, or the level of education that some employers might have wanted necessary. So the South remains, like I said, largely agricultural, and it remains one of the poorest areas of the country for quite some time. And we'll, again, as we go through the course, we'll see different things that will lead to some other demographic changes in the South, and we'll start to see population increase in the South and more industry coming into the South, particularly in the post-World War II era. We'll see that kind of change and start going the other way. Let's talk a little bit about agriculture in the South after the Civil War, because again, the South does remain largely agricultural, more agriculture than anything else. That's true even today. And obviously the South has far more industry and far more businesses and far more cities than we did even 20, 30 years ago. But it is still more agriculture than anything else. However, agriculture in the post-war South does in some cases look a little bit different. One thing we know that there's an absence of slavery. So let's just remind ourselves, this was definitely talked about, I know I did last year, about the sharecropping system. So kind of a review of that. And if you're not familiar with the sharecropping system, this is your chance to brush up on it. So, of course, in the absence of slavery, and with the South remaining largely agricultural, a different new labor system kind of develops in its place. And that system that largely replaced slavery, of course, was the system of sharecropping. And the system of sharecropping worked where a laborer, oftentimes someone that, when this all gets started, oftentimes may have been a former slave, but someone who doesn't have the money to buy their own land, they're too poor and there's no money around for them to purchase their own land. And so they enter into an agreement with a landowner, basically to live on their land, farm on their land, and they're going to pay, so they're basically like renting. But in sharecropping, the reason you call it sharecropping is because they're paying rent with what? A portion of the crop. That's the end of the deal. Is at harvest time, they will give that landowner a portion of their crop, so the landowner can then sell it and make profit. And the landowner provides, lets them live on that land, supposedly provides them the tools that they need, house to live in, those kind of things. And it's sort of, and a lot of that kind of developed because right after the war, and the South's economy was totally destitute, there was no money around, so there was no way to pay people anything. So you paid with a portion of the crop. This again, as I mentioned before, this is what most former slaves will end up doing, and this is what most poor white people will end up doing in the South. Because sharecropping, when you describe it, real aesthetically like I just did, it sounds like, okay, you're like living on somebody else's land, you pay them with crop, it's fine. But this is not a system to make a lot of money in. This is not a system that's going to really help anybody get anywhere. It perpetuates that cycle of poverty and is one of the reasons for terrible poverty in the South. Because the thing is, as we've already kind of talked about, farming is an incredibly debt-ridden business. And usually what would happen when it came time for the harvest and for you to pay your landowner, so many times, most of the time, the sharecropper is not going to be able to make the quota or pay the amount or, have the amount of crop to give that landowner. Or if they do, it doesn't leave them with anything left over for themselves. And so whatever they can't, pay this year gets roped into the next year and then again and again and again. And so it's just a cycle of debt. And as long as that sharecropper is indebted to the landowner, what does that kind of mean for them and their status and their ability to do anything else? They're just stuck. Yeah, they're stuck in this cycle of debt. They're stuck in this cycle of poverty. The fact that they're not landowners really decreases their status as well. Yes.
I've heard some people describe sharecropping as neo-feudalism.
Yes, I would agree. It is very much think of feudalism and remember the serfs and how they were just stuck on that land working for the lord of the manor. I think that's a pretty accurate description. Or some people have said it's not that much different than slavery. They're not legally owned by the person, but what are you going to do? And again, this keeps people in a cycle of poverty. It keeps people in a subservient position and contributes to the racial situation in the South as well, because this is what a lot of poor African American people will end up doing in the South. Let's talk about the agriculture itself, the crops, moving away from the labor system for a moment. Now, we know that the South has the main crop going into the Civil War was, of course, cotton. And cotton continues to be a major crop for the South. And it actually increases. There's actually more cotton growing. As much as there was being produced in the South before the Civil War, there's even more that's being produced after the Civil War. So it actually increases the amount that they were producing. But this is where we see some similarity to the West. What do we know happens when there's a lot of something being produced? The prices go down. So while cotton is increasing, the price is falling. So cotton farmers, whether they be small cotton farmers or large cotton farmers, are experiencing some of the same problems that Western farmers are, with falling prices, falling incomes, increased debt, not being able to pay for whatever it is they need, not being able to pay their bills, a lot of them going under, several of them going bankrupt, things like that. So they're experiencing some of the same troubles that a lot of farmers in the West were. And that's why, the other day we talked about, I think it was yesterday, farmers alliances and that kind of thing. You see those in the South as well. That's not just in the West. There was a Southern Farmers Alliance. There was what was called a Colored Farmers Alliance, which was African American farmers. I mentioned they have the racial discrimination prevents them from oftentimes being totally united, but they were organizing themselves into similar movements. I used some examples yesterday of Alabama farmers organizations like Alpha Insurance and that kind of stuff. So that movement, while it was largely influenced by Western agriculture, it was not exclusive to Western agriculture. It was taking place in the South as well. So those voices sometimes uniting. Now, we also see in the decades, though, following the Civil War, we do start to see some diversification of agriculture in the South. So while cotton production was increasing, there was also attempts to try to grow other things. And that happened for a variety of reasons. One, because cotton prices were falling. So a lot of farmers said, hey, I'm going to produce something else because I'm not making any money off of cotton. You also had insect situations. Some of you have heard of the whole boll weevil thing, the boll weevil monument and Enterprise that ate up lots of cotton crops, and that kind of forced a lot of farmers to diversify and start growing other things. And you have scientific research, people like George Washington Carver up here, emphasizing different crops and encouraging farmers to diversify and grow other things, such as peanuts, of course, is a big one. Peanuts become a big crop in certain places, particularly around Dothan. That becomes a big one that certainly George Washington Carver did a lot of research on, but also soybeans, sweet potatoes. While cotton is probably still the biggest crop in the South at that point, farmers were beginning to start to grow other things that in some cases turned out to be a lot more successful, and they have turned out to be a lot more profitable because it was something different and there were a lot of different uses for those crops. That's why you have the kind of funny boll weevil monument in Enterprise, a monument to an insect, basically. Because after all that was said and done, people in that area said, hey, we want to thank the boll weevil for making us do something different because it ended up being a lot better for us in the end. So that's an interesting thing to go see if you ever head down that way. So now let's take a look at the social situation, particularly the racial situation in the South, which I think we, again, talked a little bit about this at the end of our look at Reconstruction, but we're going to kind of look at how even the Supreme Court weighs in on some of the racial situation in the South. Now, we know that during Reconstruction, one of the big goals of Reconstruction by radical Republicans and others that really supported Reconstruction goals was to fully include African Americans in society, to ensure basic legal and political rights for African Americans. And there had been multiple laws passed through Reconstruction that promised or that attempted to ensure the civil rights of African Americans, preventing racial discrimination of all sorts. And you also had those constitutional amendments, namely, I'm thinking of the 14th and 15th Amendments. However, as we know, Reconstruction eventually ended. It ended in different states at different times. And after 1877, the federal government had completely abandoned the whole concept of Reconstruction. And they had, basically their policy was to allow the South to rule themselves and to do what they wanted and to handle their own race relations. So in the decades following the end of Reconstruction, we see throughout the South, one by one, reversal of most Reconstruction era protections. So I didn't go into specifically last year what some of those laws were. There were several different civil rights acts. Some of them were very similar to the constitutional amendment, some of them a little bit different. But all of those things end up being overturned by states or by courts. Some states start abolishing certain state laws that were designed to prevent racial discrimination, and even there were several court cases, some of them at the state level, some not, that invalidated all of those Reconstruction era laws that tried to prevent racial discrimination. On the ground, saying that you couldn't force people not to racially discriminate, basically to say that people have it sounds so crazy, but this was their legal reasoning, which sounds very, very disturbing, but basically arguing that Congress can't force people to not racially discriminate because people are individuals, and essentially kind of saying it's almost like free speech, and saying that, companies, businesses, if they choose not to hire African American people, or they choose not to cater to African American people or something like that, that's their right to do that. They upheld people's right to be racist, essentially, in a lot of those cases, saying that businesses amounted to private citizens, and you couldn't legislate how people treat people. So that was all, not within Congress's power. Then you get eventually the most specific addressing of racial discrimination in the South in a landmark court case that we need to make sure we know. This is one of those big, major landmark moments in the history of the Supreme Court, and that's the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896. Some of you already know this case and are familiar with it. So as Reconstruction is ending, as the federal government is turning their back on southern states and letting them kind of handle their own business, and they are starting to not enforce anti-discrimination laws, and they are passing discriminatory laws. A lot of states were starting to adopt systems of segregation and systems that discriminated against African American people in one way or the other. And such a law was challenged in the case Plessy versus Ferguson. Plessy was Homer Plessy. He was a African American man. He was mixed race, actually. I think only about an eighth African American. But most states had laws that said if you had one drop of African American blood, then you counted as an African American for purposes of racial laws. Yes.
She was first name.
Yes. And this was in the state of Louisiana. They had, among other things, separate seats on trains. You know, there were train cars that were meant for white passengers. There were train cars that were set aside for African American passengers. Homer Plessy, of course, was sitting in the white car and is told to move, and he refused. And he, of course, argued that those laws violated his rights and they violated the Constitution, specifically that they violated the 14th Amendment. So this was a constitutional challenge to the segregation laws that were starting to take shape in most southern states. Remember that 14th Amendment, let's remind ourselves what that one did. It does the whole citizenship thing, but then what did it promise for all citizens? Equal protection of the law, that's right. Basically, you could interpret that as, you know, anybody's a citizen, you have to treat all, the law has to treat all people the same, you know, legal equality of all citizens. Well, Homer Plessy argues that such, you know, laws like this that say white people have to sit there and African American people have to sit here, that violates the 14th Amendment. Now, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court upheld segregation. They upheld racial segregation as constitutional and ruled that segregation, racial segregation, did not violate the 14th Amendment. This is where, I'm sure if you haven't heard of Plessy versus Ferguson, I bet you've heard of this phrase. And this comes from the Plessy versus Ferguson case. And that is the separate but equal doctrine. And that is set aside, or that is issued by this case. It's the Plessy versus Ferguson case where the separate but equal doctrine comes from. Their reasoning in this case is that segregation does not violate the 14th Amendment of equal protection under the law as long as the facilities are equal. So you could segregate, you could separate, as long as facilities were equal. So you could separate and say you have a white car and an African American car as long as you have both of those things. As long as there is a place for African American passengers, and according to this ruling, you know, the facilities would have to be the same, you know, equal accommodations, you know, is their whole idea. Now we know that of course almost never actually happened, but that becomes the rule in the South and everywhere else for, you know, the next 60, 70 years. Although, of course, not the reality as we can see in this little cartoon right here. But basically what Plessy versus Ferguson does, you know, by upholding racial segregation, that just gives a green light to other southern states to continue segregating and to continue using a practice of legally upheld and legally sanctioned racial segregation throughout the South. Of course, I mentioned last year, this becomes known as the Jim Crow system, and these segregation laws called Jim Crow laws. So this includes all of any sort of, you know, segregation laws in public places from separate, we've already mentioned train cars, eventually, of course, that becomes buses and other things, but, you know, separate seats in theaters, separate waiting rooms, and just flat out certain businesses that just did not cater to African American patrons, restaurants that were for whites only, you know, stores that were for whites only, lunch counters that were whites only, all these sorts of things. Separate schools, you know, again, the whole separate but equal thing that you could have a white school and a black school, but they had to be, quote, equal. Again, we know that never happened. That African American schools were constantly underfunded. They got the books and the equipment that the white schools didn't want. And that, of course, becomes the case until when we get to the 1950s, of course, we'll see Plessy versus Ferguson overturned by Brown versus Board of Education. So that's things to come. So the Jim Crow system is also just the whole, you know, it really refers to more than just the legal system. It's just the social expectation of white supremacy, white dominance, African American difference that they don't question, you know, and don't rock the boat and don't try to change things. We also see the complete stripping of any political rights from African Americans during this period. I mentioned these things at the end of our look at Reconstruction. The fancy word for that is disenfranchisement. Okay, the franchise is the right to vote. So if you're disenfranchised, then what does that mean?
You don't have to.
The right vote's taken away. So we see throughout the South the mass disenfranchisement of African Americans, that right to vote that had been gained during the Reconstruction era, all but taken away. in spite of the 15th Amendment, which guaranteed African American men the right to vote. And many of you know what were some of the ways that they took away that right to vote. Poll taxes, literacy tests, those are the two big ones. I put those up here just to remind you. So, and this is part of the Jim Crow system as well. Literacy tests, which again, the 15th Amendment doesn't say that you can't use a person's intelligence or you can't use a person's ability to read. So that's how they kind of get around it and say, okay, we're not denying people the right to vote based on their race, but on these other things. Literacy tests, as I mentioned last year, they were ridiculously hard. You can go online and look up some of these. I mean, they were intended to be, they're not real tests of literacy. That's not at all what it was for. It was about disenfranchising people. It was about finding a loophole, finding a way to keep people away from voting. They are intentionally confusing. Again, they're just crazy. And furthermore, most people would not dare even try because of the other repercussions that a person would face if they even attempted to go register to vote or to take a literacy test or something like that. Poll taxes, taxes you had to pay in order to vote. And that would largely target a lot of African Americans who tended to be poor because of all these other economic circumstances that we talked about. And so they wouldn't be able to pay a poll tax in a lot of cases. So that was meant to disenfranchise African Americans or also just poor people in a lot of cases. One that I didn't mention was grandfather clauses. That one may be new to some of you. A lot of states adopted what were called grandfather clauses, which are so strange and backwards. But basically, grandfather clauses said in order to qualify to vote, your grandfather had to have been a qualified voter in like 1870 or 1860, putting it back way before. So if your grandfather qualified to vote all these decades before, then you would qualify to vote. But if your grandfather didn't qualify to vote, then you can't. Okay, now why would that affect a lot of African Americans in particular? Right, and a lot of times that grandfather clause is pulling you back to a time where African Americans were still enslaved, so there was no way that their grandfather was a voter, and so it just knocks them all out there from the beginning. And all of these things in other cases, other Supreme Court cases, both at the state and the national level, all these things are at one point or another get upheld, and the Supreme Court does not toss them out or challenge them and upholds the rights of states to do these things. We must also mention that as well as political disenfranchisement, as well as economic disadvantage, there is all other just kinds of just widespread and violent racial discrimination. And the stuff that, you can't even really understand. We don't even really have an accurate depiction of what this looked like because it was things like, African Americans were less likely to get hired for a job just for basic racial discrimination. We're going to be at a disadvantage because of underfunded schools, because of their economic situation. And for people, and also just basic justice is denied. The period between 1880, 1890s and all that is one of the worst periods for violence in the South against African Americans, of a terrible time of chronic lynching throughout the South. Many of you have heard of lynching, these mob executions of African American people. Usually they could happen in other situations, but when we're talking about the South, of course, that overwhelmingly means the mob murder of African American people for sometimes no reason at all. But people that were accused of a crime, thought to have been just getting out of line. Maybe they were too economically successful. But they were accused of something, people thought they did something, they could not expect justice. They could expect probably to be attacked by a mob. Usually when we think of lynching, a lot of people think of hanging, although it did not have to be that way. I mean, a lot of times it was, but this could mean beating somebody to death. It could mean burning somebody to death. There are thousands of African Americans, that were lynched in the southern states in the closing decades of the 19th century alone. Again, really more than we'll ever know, because a lot of it was never, recorded. People that committed these crimes were hardly, if ever, prosecuted. Justice system completely biased against African Americans and not able to seek justice for those kinds of things. And that continues, of course, to be a problem well into the 20th century. So we know that the South, but with the absence of the federal government to enforce justice. And we'll see later, we'll talk about some attempts at reforming in the South, whether that's through anti-lynching laws or different, better education. You know, we'll see these problems continue in the South, and the South kind of have a very peculiar and very strict, you know, racial structure until later. Of course, we'll see a lot of that challenged really before the Civil Rights Movement, but certainly during the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, so any questions on that? All right. I want to talk about short answer questions for a moment.